to the people of Baltimore. I heard your call to no justice, no peace.
It's a lot of brothers and women too that's incarcerated for things they had nothing to do with.
BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests.
Welcome to the Afro First Edition. I'm Sean Yoes, your host. I'm Baltimore editor of the Afro-American newspaper, the #1 black newspaper in the country. I'm here with the Mod Squad, that is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis of the Real News Network. Friends, welcome, or rather you should again
You're welcome.
be welcoming
Thank you
me
so
to
much.
your home turf.
Yes.
Let's talk, well, first of all, let me shout out Baltimore City, not shout out, that's an archaic term. Let me give my respect to Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby for being the first guest of the inaugural episode of the Afro First Edition. I wrote about that interview here in the Afro newspaper in my column. But I bring her name up specifically because we're seeing more misconduct or more ramifications of the misconduct, the pervasive misconduct within the Baltimore City Police Department, the seemingly pervasive misconduct. A third and maybe a fourth.
A fourth, yes.
Of the,
fourth.
Of
yes.
the, of
Baltimore,
the, Baltimore 7
8.
or Hateful 8.
The Hateful 8.
Characterize them.
Yeah.
The officers charged federally with racketeering back in March. A third and fourth have come forward to plead guilty.
Yeah.
In particular, Detective Gondo, also known as G-Money, who I think absolutely is exemplary of what the Gun Trace Task Force is all about. First, he robbed innocent people and suspects, and then secondly, he was quoted with saying that working 1 hour is worth working 8, which also speaks to their overtime fraud. Right. So he's an example of what's the worst about our Baltimore City Police Department.
You know what's interesting about that? That was a general practice in court overtime in Baltimore City Police. If you showed up for 1 or 2 hours, you'd get your 8. It didn't matter how long you were in court for court overtime. And that was a big problem, that we wrote about years ago because prosecutors were kind of pushing back on that. So what he was saying was not something, unique to the Gun Trace Task Force in terms of the way overtime is treated by Baltimore Police. That was actually something that was well known.
That's a really excellent point. And there was an officer in particular, was it Mauricio, or was it
Maurice Hendricks?
Evadio Hendricks, thank you so much. I believe he was the officer who was using as his defense, well, everyone's doing it when it comes to overtime fraud.
That was Taylor.
Okay, Marcus Taylor, that was it.
Yeah, argued that what he was doing was not, and he's right when it comes to overtime.
Right.
I mean, I firmly believe that he's
right.
Well,
what he was saying that I should be given bail. I should be released.
Right.
Because this is business as usual.
And I think that really exemplifies what Stephen was saying. If officers are used to putting extra money in their pockets from overtime that they didn't earn, what's the next step between taking money out of the pocket of someone who they think is committing an illegal act? And then the next step is, well, we can just tax these people. So I don't like the argument that it's a slippery slope in general. But I think once you start cheating your employer, cheating the taxpayers, cheating the residents of Baltimore City, I think it makes it easier and easier until eventually you're outright stealing from them.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point because overtime has always been a very questionable practice at Baltimore City Police. I mean, just this last year, they spent about $40 million in overtime, which is about 25 million over budget. But that's been going on for years and years. And the proof has been, or there's been plenty of proof of people. I interviewed a person 10 years ago who said, if you wrote 4 tickets, you got 8 hours of overtime and you went home. Or if I interviewed cops that said if you made 2 or 3 arrests, you get 8 hours of overtime. It wasn't about the time you spent. It was like a performance bonus. So like if you did X, Y, and Z, you get your 8 and you go home. So really what these officers were doing, I don't think is unusual, at least in terms of the, the overtime. I think, and that's something we really got to talk about here because really the idea that I think being sort of, I guess, espoused by the police commissioner is somehow this was unusual behavior. That these men don't represent Baltimore City Police Department. Well, where did they get this idea of 1 for 8? Did they make this up themselves? And where did they get this idea that they could file for overtime while they're on the beach in South
They were in
Carolina?
Rehoboth Beach, I think.
Rehoboth Beach, but one was actually down in Myrtle Beach.
Right.
Where did they get this idea? Does this come from something? Is this just something they make? These are like the geniuses of overtime theft? I don't think so, because there have been continuous scandals, and I interviewed people who says very specifically, hey, so all they have to do is get a gun, right? They get a gun, and it was probably a wink, like, put your 8 hours overtime, and you bought in 3 guns today. So I think that what Taya brought up is a really good point, that this is not something that just suddenly started with the Gun Trace Task Force, or what they did was that unusual.
Well, let's shift to the officers connected to the death of Freddie Gray. It was announced this week that two or three
of them are taking the Nero and Miller.
Discipline.
I think are taking.
What is this discipline that they're going to receive?
Well, they get some unpaid days where they basically be like, you were off work for a week, you're suspended without pay. I think it might have been vacation. I'm not even sure if it was it might have been vacation or unpaid days.
I think they lost vacation days.
Is it vacation? Yeah. So that's one of it's a punishment. What's interesting about it is we have this thing where you actually have the trial boards, this was all a result of a trial board. So there was an investigation of the officers, totally separate by the Montgomery County Police, which found punishment for 5 out of the 6 officers. And I think Nero and Miller were found, to have committed the least serious infractions.
Now, Nero and Miller were 2 of the officers who jumped on Freddie Gray
who were arrested in the first place, yeah. And so the 3 other officers have been recommended fire, which would be Rice, Sergeant White, and who's the other one?
Would it be Porter?
Porter actually Porter.
Goodson then.
Goodson, yeah. So Goodson, right, the van driver. They all are facing firing. But what's interesting is that because of the passing of the police reform law, these trial board hearings, which are administrative hearings, are actually public now, and they're going to be held at City Hall. So all the officers who were going to have their trial boards held at City Hall have pled out and sort of accepted the punishment. Of course, these 3 officers now are going to actually have trial boards, which could be sort of a relitigation of what happened on that day. Right. It could be, who knows what's going to come out, because they said they're going to use an outside prosecutor to prosecute the cases. And it is kind of, as a person who's actually sat in trial board before they were public, because I was, summoned to go to a trial board. It was like a kangaroo court experience. They brought me up there and started screaming at me, literally for like a half an hour, screaming at me about my stories. It's kind of like a court trial. You have a prosecutor, you have a defense attorney, you have 3 police officers, usually commanders now, who sit in judgment. So it's conceivable that we could hear evidence. It's going to be interesting to see how the department handles it, because we could hear evidence about what happened that day that we haven't heard before.
And I think that just speaks to how Marilyn Mosby's, our city state's attorney, her actions have been historic on so many levels. I don't think we'd be having a trial board open to the public if it hadn't been for her incredibly bold action of indicting these officers and prosecuting these Freddie Gray officers. And not only that, her office now has to go through all this body camera footage of the police department and go through them, and we've already seen some of that body-worn camera footage of officers reenacting or planting drugs on suspects, and then they have to throw out all those cases. So, for example, there was Ivan Potts, who was a young man who was put in jail for possession of a gun, and he was arrested by 2 of the 7 members of the Gun Trace Task Force. Well, of course they're going to have to throw out that case, but not after he lost 4 years of his life, and he had claimed his innocence the entire time. So the city state's attorney's office is just under incredible pressure from the FOP, from the police department, but also from the public to say we can't let these dirty cops continue to be part of our police department and prey on the citizens of Baltimore.
About 900, close to 900 cases so far have been tainted because of
300 related to the Gun Trace Task Force and 500 related. Now, when you think about that number, that's 900 people. Now, it could be multiple charges, some people, but
it could be
still
multiple
talking
people.
It could be multiple people. So you're probably talking somewhere approximately like 900 people. Lives have been completely disrupted with. These are drug and gun charges. These aren't, jaywalking charges. These are serious charges. People who probably spent time in jail, people who probably had to make bail, people who might have had to hire a lawyer or use a public defender. The justice system is very deliberate and very slow, and to put that amount of input, trash, into that system is one of the reasons it doesn't work. It doesn't achieve its goal, which is to, you know, separate the people who are violent from the general population, because there's so much trash in it. And it's inconceivable how much. I mean, Marilyn Mosby was one of the only state's attorneys who has a conviction integrity unit, just because she's had so many problems since she's been state's attorney.
When you say trash, you mean trash cases.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, I mean, like,
So
it's just like these
people
writing
us.
I'm sorry, that's not what I mean. I mean just these cases that are just worthless.
Let's go back. Let's speak about Mosby a little bit more. She was very open and frank during our conversation about the racial attacks that she has been under since she indicted those 6 officers in the first place.
It's horrifying.
There was no support from the law enforcement, virtually no support from the law enforcement community when she indicted those 6 officers connected to the death of Freddie Gray. The trajectory has changed a little bit recently, and she mentioned this also. USA Today wrote an opinion piece praising her for her handling of these contaminated cases with these body-worn cameras. It's interesting because USA Today is no bastion of progressive thought, I don't think necessarily. But to see them praise her and say that more prosecutors should be taking up the mantle as she has is an interesting
I think
development.
What Marilyn Mosby said, which was interesting to me watching the interview, was how it reveals the true power dynamics of policing in Baltimore. Because as a person who's covered courts, and I'm sure you know this, Sean, that people rarely criticize a prosecutor before a trial is occurred. Because they're scared, because the prosecutor has the final say. Never happens. Never. I mean, it might be mild. But
do you remember any really sharp criticism of Greg Bernstein?
No.
The previous?
No, not people crawling out of the woodwork like Alan Dershowitz or Paige Croyder popping up on CNN dissing him. No, not at all.
And, I mean, I think we should be very, people talk about Freddie Gray, and you hear a lot of, people say, well, she charged prematurely. But anybody who wants to say that should sit through the trial and listen to the way this young man died. He died a torturous death. He died from, a spinal injury. His spine was severed. And what happens is your extremities, and you start to lose feeling and functionality. So you basically slowly are paralyzed in pain. So the pain must be torturous. You can feel your lungs shutting down. Your body is suddenly going numb. So to say somehow that no one should be held responsible for that that's just somehow accidental, shows you the power dynamics of policing in this country.
No, as she has said over and over again, Freddie Gray did not kill himself.
No, he did not.
And I think some of the blowback that she received has to do with the fact that she is a woman and that she is a black woman. I mean, she mentioned, I'm not sure if I have the statistic exactly right, but she said she is like 1% of all elected prosecutors in the country are African American women. So that must mean it's her and one other. I mean, that's it's like 2 women.
Well, and then you make the point that being a woman and being a woman of color. I mean, she spoke specifically. She mentioned specifically. One of the notes of the thousands of people who attacked her in racial ways. I mean, she mentioned specifically.
Right. They attacked her based on being a woman, and they attacked her based on being a black woman, very specifically with their language.
You racist N-bomb B.
Right.
Yeah. I'm trying to clean it up for the real news.
Thank you. Thank you.
But think about that.
Well,
I mean, I wrote about it in my column. It's really the embodiment of what we're seing as far as the dynamic of race playing out in Trump America, right?
Absolutely.
It's the white supremacist triple play. I mean, you refer to a black woman as a B and as an N, and then you blame her for being the racist.
Exactly.
Well, the thing that I think that caused the anger was the fact that, policing in cities like Baltimore plays a great role in constructing our ideas about race, especially about the ideas about what it means to be black. And part of that is a great narrative of failure that's constructed every day, a great sort of narrative of agency, which isn't deserved, right? Because it's a big town full of criminals. And I think Marilyn Mosby shifted that to the point that it made people extremely uncomfortable. Like, you know what? I mean, because what she revealed was so ugly and was willing to call people out for it, that I think the people who have lived off and thrived off this narrative of black failure felt like they had to respond in a way and shut it down. Because once you let that door open and the truth starts coming out, you're going to be dealing with a lot of stuff.
Well,
you
I
know?
mean, you make a really important point. I mean, that's if we expand the context, if you will, when Barack Obama was elected 44th president of the United States, the first black man to hold the chair. The backlash, if you will, it's almost the same dynamic.
Yeah. Right.
The backlash was like, we've got to do something. We've got to respond to the fact that the White House is no longer the last bastion of white supremacy necessarily.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's go the antithesis of Barack Obama and let's elect
Absolutely.
the 45th president of the United States. And we've seen how the racial
much of the
narrative
ugliness
played
you saw
out.
during the Freddie Gray, post-Freddie Gray, not just conviction, but indictment was the same thing that drive Trump's election, the same sort of energy.
Absolutely.
And Taya and I also witnessed when we were covering Pocono.
Of course.
Right, and it was a complete, 45's presidency, and when he ran his campaign, was a complete repudiation of everything President Obama and his family stood for. And when you were watching the campaign speeches or the GOP, their national convention, there was actually a sheriff that stepped onto stage and said, "I have good news for everyone here." The officers charged with the death of Freddie Gray, he announced that it's going to be a mistrial.
Yeah.
And there was like an ovation.
It was Clark, wasn't it?
I think it was
Clark?
Sheriff Clark,
Yeah,
right? The African American with the cowboy hat.
The semi-black
The biggest sin that Marilyn Mosby committed was she made the case that Freddie Gray was a human being with the same rights and the same agency of any person in this country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that really, really shocked, I think, many people. Because if you look at it through that prism and you say, what is our criminal justice system but a big torture chamber for the people of the city who are African American? So she made that mistake, and they wanted to make her pay for it. And I think that's what happened.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Because I mean, when you talk to people about it, I mean, there's nothing rational about it. I mean, like I said, everyone should have sat in that courtroom and watched and listened to the medical examiner testify about what happened to that young man. I mean, anyone who cares about humanity heard what happened to that young man, what they allowed to happen, how he slowly died, and they kept opening the doors and looking at him and never responding to anything when he was like defecating himself and stuff.
Right. I mean, and how often do police officers open the back of the paddy wagon to check on somebody? Really is that a natural practice for officers to check 5 times in the back of the six times even? In the back of a paddy wagon to make sure the person's okay? Absolutely not.
So
they had to have known that was an injured person in the back of the van.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time left, but we found out that there was who the independent monitor for the implementation of the Department of Justice consent decree with the city is going to be. It's going to be Ken Thompson, the veteran lawyer with Venable Law Firm, I believe. To the dismay of many community activists, even though, to be fair, Tyrone Powers, who was someone who was favored by many community activists, has mentioned Ken Thompson and has referred to him as a good man and someone who, but ultimately, the point I'm making here, regardless of what we or anybody else feels about Ken Thompson or Tyrone Powers, is that the person who has been chosen or who is going to be chosen as the independent monitor for the implementation of the consent decree, it's an extremely powerful and important position as we move forward in this in law enforcement reform in this city and in this nation.
Critical. I mean, you're not going to get another chance at this. Believe me, it's going to be a long time before there's another consent decree.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that's why I think people were so upset because, I think Dr. Tyrone Powers I think the thing I worry about with a lawyer tends to believe the system is more functional than a police officer who's been inside. I think it would have been better to have a guy who's been there, who knows what goes on behind the doors of the Baltimore City Police headquarters. I don't think a lawyer is going to be skeptical enough. I just don't.
I think you make an excellent point that Powers knows how police officers act. He knows the culture of policing, and he knows how they think, which means that he's not going to allow himself to be BS'd by them quite as easily as someone who is an outsider, someone who comes from the other side of the criminal justice system, who's always been trained to trust what officers are saying because that's how they base their cases.
And to be
he's
fair,
not going to be skeptical enough.
No one has said anything bad about this law partner. I mean, everyone, he has impeccable and credibility, But I do think that you're going into a very difficult job, and if you don't know what really goes on and have the sources to tell you,
Right.
it's going to be hard for him to do the job that I think he needs to do.
Right. I mean, I'm not attempting to relitigate who should have been chosen, but the point is, this is a really critical position.
Absolutely.
At a incredibly critical time in our city's history,
Yes.
a real
Incredible expenditure of public funds. I mean, is it 1.7 or 1.4? Whatever it is, it's a couple
1.7 million, I think.
1.7 million per year. And the city, you know, when we were listening to Catherine Pugh recently, she said it was going to cost $10 million down in Annapolis. She testified it was going to be
Right.
$10 million extra a year or something.
But that it could go even higher,
yeah.
is what she said.
So
10 million,
when are we
or
going
it
to
could be
spend this
higher.
kind of money and invest it? And
invested in a department that many people feel is broken.
right.
Yes.
And the thing is that this all came down to the judge, really, from what I've heard. The judge felt more comfortable with the lawyer than he did with hiring Powers. And that's why this happened. So this just goes to show you that what should be more of a community process, I mean, it's our money. You know, that's coming out of our pockets, I mean, as a city taxpayer.
Right.
So why is it up to some judge to sit there and say, well,
And to handpick his own team. I want
Right, he
someone from
picked- it was like
Bentonville. I want
cherry-picked.
someone from Exeter. He handpicked his home team.
Yeah.
And I just think for the community, for the activists in the community, that this is incredibly disappointing, because I'm sure they feel like their voices weren't heard at all.
I think that's a reasonable.
You know, despite the transparency of the
Right.
process.
I'm not sure what the word
Well,
is, but beef, let's say.
Well,
Complaint.
It's just another assignment for the Mod Squad to continue to
Sure.
Yeah, we're
stay
gonna
on
stay,
top of.
we'll stay
and
on
we
top of
will.
this. We've
We
been to
will.
all the hearings, so we will be there. I don't know what's going to
Absolutely.
happen next, but we'll be there.
I'm Sean Yoes, host of the Afro First Edition. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.